So in the previous video, we talked about demand. Now we're going to turn our attention to the other side of the market, the supply side. So just as we had before, we start off with our schedule, in this case, our supply schedule. And first column here showing you different prices. In our second or right-hand column, we have different quantities. Now, of course, one major difference is that in this case, as the price goes down, the quantity supplied also goes down. And so again, we can graph this out, putting price on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis. Again, start down here at 0.5. All the way up to our 250. And we can, actually, I always find it easier to start down at the lower price and work our way up. 3 to 4, 5, 6, and 7. You can imagine our supply curve looks a little something like this. So here's our supply curve. And again, as you notice now, here the supply curve is upward sloping. Right? So as the price increases, sellers are going to want to supply more onto the market. And this should be pretty straightforward and intuitive. Right? You can imagine if you're a company and you've got to figure out how much you're willing to supply, how much you're willing to produce and supply onto the market. Well, if the price of your good goes up, you're going to find it worthwhile to produce even more. Now, we're focusing here on the market supply, right? Before we focused on the market demand. Now, ultimately, you might have the question, what really underpins this market supply curve? And we can talk at a later point when we talk about theory of the firm in a few chapters, that really this all comes from individual firms' supply curves, which are tied to their cost functions, right? Their production technology and the cost of their inputs. So we have here what we call our, right, just as we had the law of demand, we have our law of supply. Price goes up, firms will want to supply more, right? The quantity supplied increases. Price goes down, quantity supplied decreases. And just as we did when we talked about demand, we want to think about, well, what affects the position of the supply curve in our graph here. Right? And so just as we have before, we have these ceteris paribus conditions, right? All of these other factors that affect the position of the supply curve. So what might those be? So just as we did before, we'll go ahead and draw a supply graph here. And we have some initial supply curve S1. And we can think about, well, what would a shift from S1 to, say, S2 be? Right? Now, does this represent an increase or a decrease in supply? Now, a lot of people look at this and they say, well, the supply curve looks like it's lower now, so that should be a decrease. I always encourage you to do just what we did with the video right on demand. Pick some price. And then go ahead and draw that price over to the two supply curves. At S1, that quantity supplied would be Q1. On S2, that quantity supplied would be Q2. So take a look there. When we shift the supply curve from S1 to S2, right, we do what? What are we doing? We're increasing, right? At that price P0, the quantity supplied increases from Q1 to Q2. So that is an increase in supply. Conversely, if we were to shift from S1 up to S3, and we would see that the quantity supplied would fall from Q1 to Q3, right, while holding that price constant. So a shift from S1 to S3 would be a decrease in supply. So now the question is, well, what factors affect the position of the supply curve? Okay. I already alluded to one of those. That is the price of inputs. Now, what is an input? Well, an input is anything the firm uses to make its product or its service, right? Its good or service. And so this is the labor, right? The workers, the capital, the materials. It could be aluminum, steel, plastics, water, right? Crude oil, whatever that might be, right? So you have all of your inputs. Now, what happens if the price of your inputs falls? Well, that's going to make it cheaper for you as a producer to make more of your good. And so that'll shift your supply curve out, right? You'll increase supply. Conversely, if the price of inputs goes up, then that would decrease supply. So whenever we're start talking about different types of changes, whether they might be changes that are kind of just coming, what we say, exogenously into our analysis, so they just kind of happen, right? The firms have no control over it. It's not something the government's doing. In that case, we can think about how all those outside changes might affect, say, the price of inputs and then ultimately supply. We could also think about how different government interventions in a market might affect, not just directly affect the market, but in terms of, say, like a price control that we'll talk about in the future, but what if it affects, say, the price of inputs, right? So there might be some indirect on a market that way. Another major factor is technological change. Right? The printing press made it a lot cheaper to make copies of books. So the supply of books increased substantially after the invention and then the spread of that technology too, right? The printing press. And it's not just enough for a technology to exist. Firms have to be able to adopt it as well. So you can think of, the introduction of a new production technology that lowers costs of production will increase supply. And you might actually see that effect lasting for some time as that technology spreads throughout a market. Another factor we have to think about is the number of firms in the marketplace. So if you have more firms in the market, that will increase supply, shift us from, say, S1 to S2. If the number of firms decreases, that would shift us from S1 to S3. Now I have to ask, well, what determines whether firms enter or exit the market? When we talk about perfectly competitive markets, the exit and entry of firms is going to be a very crucial feature of long-run equilibrium in that market, or in those kinds of markets. Other things that might affect the number of firms could be things like government regulations, right, that make it more or less difficult for firms to enter. And if you have different kinds of fixed costs imposed, in some cases, the government might come in and actually limit the number of firms, right, by granting local monopolies, like we used to see back in the day with cable television, or in the case of, say, utilities, where we just don't allow anybody other than the government provider to exist. And we also want to think about, again, things like substitutes and complements in production. So what is a substitute in production? Well, one great example we have is from agriculture. If you're a farmer, you might have the option of, say, planting corn or soybeans. Okay. So if the price of soybeans goes up, that would cause you to supply less corn, because you're going to switch from planting as much corn, you're going to shift over to soybeans. On the other hand, we could think about complements in production. Right? So one really good example, again, coming to us from agriculture is, what if the price of leather goes up? Well, where do we get leather from? Cows. And so if you're a farmer, you may end up supplying more beef because the price of leather has gone up, which means you're going to want to have an increase in the quantity of leather that you're supplying. But in order to supply more leather, you're going to have to raise more cows. And of course, you're not just going to throw the beef away, so you end up supplying more beef on the market as well. And just as we had before, right, expectations of prices in the future. right? And our textbook has a great example talking about the iPhone, right? In that Apple does not want any of its customers talking about the new, right, the upcoming version of the iPhone, because it could have an impact in a negative way on demand today. Well, we have similar things in terms of on the supply side, right? If you're a firm that's producing a certain product, maybe you're Samsung, and if you think that there might be a drop in prices in the future because Apple's going to come out with a new iPhone, or there might be a new firm coming in the market, that might cause you to change your supply. Okay? And that we see that as well. Think about markets where prices tend to fluctuate a lot, like maybe in energy markets. Right? You think about the fracking industry that we've seen. Right? When the price of oil was really high, we saw a lot more fracking going on. Well, but there's also, that supply also had to look at future prices. If you're looking at, say, price of oil is high today, but if you're expecting oil to drop, maybe you end up supplying more today and don't invest to produce as much in the future. So all of these are ceteris paribus factors. A change in any one of these will cause our supply curve to shift. And again, it's important to note, we talk about a movement of the entire supply curve as a change in supply, whereas we talk about moving from one point to another on our supply curve as a change in the quantity supplied. Okay? Movement along the supply curve is a change in quantity supplied. Shifting the supply curve is a change in supply. Well, now that we've talked about demand and supply, we need to put both sides of the market together and talk about market equilibrium.